Hello and welcome to House, the Shared Living Summit, live from UKREiiF. Thanks for that, we didn't have to put the canned laughter in. Now, House, for those of you that don't know, is a weekly podcast covering all the news, views and insights from the rented shared living sectors. And this is the first time all the rented living sectors have had a shared platform at UKREiiF. So whether you're student housing, HMO, PBSA, BTR, co-living, single family housing, any other acronyms, rented later living, and you're an operator, a developer, an investor or tech, all of this should be in one conversation. So let's start with some introductions. I am Dan Smith from Resi Consultancy and VerbaFlow AI.
I'm Deanie Lee from the Property Marketing Strategists.
And I'm Sarah Canning from the Property Marketing Strategists.
And this episode would not be possible without our sponsor, Alasco. So very grateful to them for sponsoring this podcast and also the summit in general. Now, ultimately, we want to talk through some key themes and try and sort of keep some threads running through the conversations across the course of this summit. And I think the key theme that we're really looking at is change. You know, there's a real sense this year that all the fundamentals of the sectors are shifting all at once. And I think we've got three core themes with political change, regulatory change, and technological change. So, we want to really make sure that we're covering all of that. You know, from a political standpoint, who knows? Prime Minister Andy Burnham may be here a little bit later on. Apparently, he was here yesterday, and we have many other ministers in play at the moment. There's different and changing ministerial priorities that we see at the moment. We've got planning uncertainty, slowing delivery down, and ultimately it's leading to harder investment decisions.
I guess despite all that, though, what we are seeing is that investment into this sector is still there. There is appetite for it. Uncertainty makes long-term investment hard, and it's certainly unpredictable, but it's still there. So there's definitely still some positives that we can talk about. I'm going to be leading a fireside chat on Thursday at 12:45 with MP Samantha Dixon, talking about some of those regulatory things as well. So if you are still around on Thursday, please come back and see what they have to say about that.
Yeah, so Samantha Dixon is the Minister for Building Safety. So we're very excited to have her here, honestly. Building safety is obviously absolutely vital in terms of our development and what we're looking at in terms of moving those pipelines forward, which is another challenge that we're going to come to fairly shortly. But, there is a real challenge here across a, geopolitical context with debt markets and how that's looking, with the construction cost, the viability pressures as well.
And we also have that geopolitical context. We've also got Trump in power, and we're going to be discussing that in a Trump world. Does sustainability, DEI and social impact matter, which will be tomorrow at 11 a.m. So I think that'll be a really interesting discussion. So there's lots going on. Beyond that, we've already kind of talked about, there's the Building Safety Act, there's delivery delays due to gateway delays, the remediation costs. We've also got the Renters' Rights Reform Act, which came in beginning of this month. So there is just a pile of operational uncertainty, and I think these are the things that I'm looking forward to discussing over the next few days.
And then on the technological change standpoint, I don't want to break it down too easily to AI versus humans. We've got written down innovation versus entrenchment, but I do think that's something that we do need to be mindful of. The fact that, yes, AI, of course, is going to be a key buzzword. We've got panel today at 3 p.m, so don't miss that. But we can't lose sight of the human element and the nature of community building. I think that's really important for us. There's also going to be the cross-sector collaboration panel today at 2 p.m, university partnerships and city regeneration tomorrow at 1:30, and then the marketing panel on Thursday at 11 a.m. Do stick around until Thursday for that. And actually for our final podcast, which I think is at 2 p.m, correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, I think it's really important that we are able to focus on technology with some action points rather than just taking AI, thinking, okay, what looks cool, what should we implement, and actually thinking what is really moving the needle at the moment. So all of these panels, we're really going to focus on those actions out of the back of it. So do take note of that.
I guess the thread that sort of brings all of that together is one of the sessions that I'm most looking forward to is we're bringing together residents from all of those different living sectors in one place, because all of the things that you've just sort of brought up, really, they all impact the end user, they all impact residents, they all impact people that need homes, and we can't lose sight of that.
And I'm moderating that panel, and we've got a really great bunch of residents, so please do make sure you come along to that. It'll be a really good session.
Yeah, and that has been like getting blood out of a stone, getting good residents. So please do come along to that and make it worth it. And it's a really interesting one. And actually at Property Week, I remember that panel that you moderated, Deanie, there. And it was so well attended. The feedback was absolutely incredible from it. So I think it's definitely worth sticking around and understanding from the horse's mouth, as it were, if we can call our residents the horses, exactly what they want. And that can be from an AI perspective and how they actually want to talk with each operator, etc. But it can be what amenities do they want, how do they want to be sold to, etc. All of these things, but obviously underpinning all of that is how the markets are really looking at the moment. So if we can move on to content block 1, as we've called it.
Catchy.
We're going to cover each of the sectors in turn, effectively. We want to make sure that we're able to talk about all of the shared living sectors, because there are quite a few panels here which are bringing together all of that shared living sector across the board, and that is changing so rapidly, and it's becoming, there's a lot of focus on hybrid, there's a lot of merging of sectors, and that transformation is absolutely key. I don't think we can now pin student housing or students just down to PBSA or university halls or HMO. There's what some in the PBSA sector would call the shadow market of BTR and co-living, which we'll come on to in a bit. But starting with student housing, I think those headlines, they have turned pretty negative recently, and what we want to look at and sort of lean on as much as we can is that data point. Like, are those headlines actually negative in terms of the investment or the development and the operation side of things? Because when you look at some of the key trends, UCAS applications are at record highs. International demand is still growing for the majority of markets, and that demand is concentrating around stronger universities. Now, that has always been the case. There is a flight to quality, there always has been. It's that the internationals in particular are focused on that. And what we need to uncover is the investment supporting what is needed, or are we going to see more voids? And by more voids, I think StuRents cover this very well in terms of their occupancy data, showing that it's around sort of 85% or so, the average occupancy in PBSA in particular. And we don't just want to focus on PBSA. We have HMO, we have university halls, and all of the other sectors within students as well. But that occupancy is clearly softening. Talk to any operator in the room, that occupancy is clearly softening. The rental growth is normalising, and that premium product is dominating pipeline. I spoke to a CEO the other day who said we can only build Waitrose at the moment, and actually what we probably need is a few Lidls and a few Aldis here and there, and certainly some...
I think you'll find I coined that analogy, actually, Dan.
Then fair play, because that was then regurgitated to me by one of the largest CEOs out there. But ultimately, it just means that that sort of the rental growth is normalising. That premium product, it's the only thing that is viable at the moment, and that's the real concern.
But in what way is that viable, Dan? I think it's viable to build.
Yeah.
But is that going to get your occupancy? And I think that's the challenge the sector has.
What does that look like from an operational standpoint 2 years, 3 years down the line? Now, this is again the difference where the change in capital profile and the change in investor returns is really quite sharp at the moment, with the short 3 year holds, okay, buy it, do a little bit to it, flip it, on you go. That seems to be dissipating, and it looks like the long-term capital, institutional capital, is really starting to look very seriously, in particular at PBSA, but also at student housing in the HMO market as well. We've seen Brookfield and Tokoro Capital and various others really coming into play in that market. But in terms of HMO landlords overall, they are leaving the market in droves, and so we know that is then applying to student HMOs. Ask any residential letting agent, student letting agents, they will tell you that they have less properties to deal with now. And I think that is going to be a real concern in terms of affordability.
I think what's interesting, though, is we can see from UCAS applications that the numbers of students is strong. that hasn't changed. And
Yeah.
you kind of look at particular cities and you're like, why are there so many voids? Because the numbers of students haven't changed significantly enough. But they have more choice now. They're commuting a lot more, and they're living in BTR. And I think we've just got to be conscious that just because there may be less of the cheaper, less good quality HMOs in the market, PBSA isn't able to provide an equivalent value proposition effectively. They're not all going to suddenly move into BTR and PBSA just because the HMOs aren't there. It's really a dangerous thought to think that really cheap end of the market, yes, we know it's not brilliant quality, but it provided a home for people that wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford to live away at university, hence the rise in commuters.
Yeah.
I think we have a long-standing product gap in PBSA that is the big issue, and it's an even bigger issue because of the viability issue. So actually, I think everyone knows what we need to build, and we know we need to build more affordable, but from a viability perspective, that's getting harder and harder to do. And that's why I think so much of what we're talking about at UKREiiF is going to be about that regulation and the policies that are coming down that's actually stifling at the ability to build something that actually the sector needs.
That building affordable, it just doesn't feel possible right now. I'm looking around the room to some fairly blank faces. No one's putting their hands up and saying, I've got some ideas, although I can see Nick from Whittam Cox at the back there, so I'm sure he's got some ideas here and there. But ultimately, that is one of the major challenges we've got. It's that spread of, this isn't a supply crisis that we've got in student housing. This is an affordability crisis, and I think the sooner that we actually acknowledge that, and it does feel like, I think, especially from LD events the other day, it seems like the panel and some of the sessions were basically saying, look, we don't need the 600,000 beds for PBSA that we thought we did just a year ago. Literally last year, those reports from some of the agents are saying 600 and something thousand beds we need by 2030. It's now something more like 70-odd thousand, but in the right locations. I'll be honest, I think we've helped to steer that ship slightly, or at least we've called it out early, because that's been our biggest frustration, the fact that I think there are certain forces within the market that are trying to really sort of push that, or have been trying to push that narrative, understandably. And some of it was based on legacy, but student sentiment especially can turn on a knife edge, and that's the issue that we've had. And I think that has changed this year. And Unite's now changed. Their occupancy forecast is now 95.2%. Their rental growth is slowing to 2 to 3. Knight Frank's thinking everyone's going to be roughly around the 2% mark on average. But PBSA investment is still so damn strong. 4.3 billion in 2025. Like, that is still a staggering sum. So the investment is there. It's a case of the capital profile changing. I think that's one key thing to recognise.
I think as well we need to consider about the range of customers. I think we're very good at providing for the international student, but yet the international student is changing and becoming different, and actually it's not all Chinese students that can afford the more expensive accommodation. So we've got a range of international students coming in, but also who's providing for that domestic middle market. And I think this is the risk factor, is that so much of that domestic market is now thinking, actually, with the cost of going to live at university, I'm just going to commute and I'm just going to stay at home. And I think that, coupled with the ones that can actually think, actually, I can afford to go and live somewhere, but actually BTR is offering me a little bit more of what I want than actually PBSA, that's where I think we're seeing some of those issues around occupancy and voids, because, like you say, Sarah, I think there's more choice and there's more options, but we haven't got the range of product covering all those different customer types.
Yeah, I mean, renters' rights reform, that is... I can't wait to see what happens. If I'm morbidly curious. I'm morbidly curious as to what that's going to mean for student HMO landlords, for PBSA, for BTR. We know PBSA is exempt, but what's it going to mean in terms of that demand profile? It's going to be fascinating to see. And like I said, there's already some serious attrition there in terms of student HMO landlords and HMO in general. PBSA is also struggling to get a bit of a grip with new contracts being given out on the first and switching over tenancy agreements, and what that actually looks like for each person that is going to be a real struggle.
I mean, I've said this several times, but I think it's a real risk for PBSA to sit back and think, well, I'm exempt, I'll just carry on as normal, because the market's changed. And actually, if you've got the option to go and rent a HMO or a BTR and leave when you want, as a student, I think I'd go and do that. So I kind of think that that's where PBSA have got to get really smart about thinking about flexibility, thinking about different ways you can run those tenancy contracts so that you're offering something that's similar to what is able on the open market.
If you go back to our first episode, we talk about 3 key themes, and it's something that goes through pretty much all of our consultancy work as well, where we're focusing on affordability, on flexibility, and at that time we were focusing on sustainability as well. And
Trump shifted that.
Yeah, Trump to a certain extent, I think yes, and we will come onto that on the panel, which I think will be a great panel, and we've been really pleased that we kept that title in there, because Trump has shifted the narratives negatively for the most part across pretty much everything, but I think there is going to be a real need to double down on that sustainability and make sure that from a European perspective we do have a lot of that. But back to the sort of the supply demand side of things, I think having that this is the era of flexibility, I think, and we've seen that from previous podcasts with the likes of Lavanda and the way that students are going to demand that flexibility. They're going to want to get out of very long contracts, and so are they just going to go, I'll just go to student HMO and then I can give my notice just before my exams or whatever.
Although you say that, we've done some research, and it's about choice really, because there's many international students that actually need to be in the UK for 52 weeks plus 52 weeks plus 52. They've got nowhere else to go as well. So it's not saying that everybody is going to want to leave at the end of May. There's plenty that do, but they it's one or the other at the moment, and I think that's where that flexibility in student accommodation is going to have to come in. And like we said, that's kind of where BTR is possibly stealing a march here.
Sorry, Deanie.
I was going to say, I think that's the problem. One size fits all has been too prominent in PBSA for too long, and I think that is not how it is anymore. And like you say, Sarah, I think, yes, some students want the comfort of a 51, 52-week contract, but there's a whole load that don't, and actually we've got to provide those different options around them. Sorry, Dan.
I agree. We know that from Price Hubble stats, we know that 30% of BTR residents are students. Now, we could do with some more data there. Are they postgrads? Are they Chinese postgrads? Are they undergrads? Like, what does that look like? But, that as a headline figure is quite staggering. It shows that the shadow market, in inverted commas, is one of those things that we do need to take notice of, especially when building, because if you could build a BTR product where students could come or young professionals could come or whatever, why would you change? Why would you be a PBSA? That is definitely an issue. I mean, for starters, it's difficult to get BTR off the ground no matter what. But is BTR now doing the job that PBSA has priced itself out of? That sounds like a bit of a controversial statement.
I don't think it's price. I think it's product.
Yeah.
And flexibility as well. We have talked a lot about this on the podcast, and we know that there's lots of regulations that impact student accommodation that don't impact the other living sectors, and that potentially is a pull for students as well. Ultimately, they don't care. There's no label that they understand. They're just looking for somewhere to live in the right location at the right price, and they'll go for the product that suits them better. And maybe the 6-bedroom cluster flat with a corridor with a kitchen at the end isn't what is suiting their needs in this modern lifestyle, and that hasn't really changed. So I think BTR, and single family, we can't forget that everyone calls it single family housing, but actually there's nothing stopping multi-families living in single family housing as well. So all of those product types are just showing this huge range of options for different tenants to live in at whatever kind of stage of their life they're in, really.
I think the plea, I guess, I've got for BTR is don't do what PBSA did and just provide for one area of the market. And I think there's a real risk that BTR is doing that because of the planning issues, the viability issues, that actually it makes more sense to build more high-end accommodation. And I think there is a real risk that BTR is going to go down that route. And I think that's my plea, is actually people need to rent somewhere, and BTR has a role to play in that. So does PBSA, and I think actually making sure we're covering off all those kind of product types is really important.
I think anyone that works in PBSA is frustrated by BTR, to be honest. And you only have to walk down the road in Leeds, in the city centre, and you can see, that actually a lot of the people walking out of these BTR buildings they are students. There are Mandarin speaking teams trying to get the Chinese postgrads in. Like that Leeds is almost ground zero for that. But we've seen it in every other city, and we all want BTR to stand on its own 2 feet. Not have to need that 30% just to make get through mobilisation. And actually, talking to a few operators, they are seeing less students the older the property gets. It's typically a mobilisation factor that a lot of people are really sort of focusing on. And I think that is healthy. There is no reason why BTR shouldn't be attracting students. The students are living there for good reason. And it may be as simple as offers better flexibility, shorter contract rates. It can be as simple as has a washing machine and a dryer in my kitchen in my apartment, or has a 3-bed apartment. Price definitely is a factor. Location is a factor. All of those good things. So I think, yes, the shadow market can be a bit of an unhelpful concept or term for BTR or co-living or whatever it might be, but I think that's where there is a real need to say, right, BTR's attracting students, why is that, what should that look like, and run that through planning as well. The amount of planners that I've spoken to and chief planning officers for pretty big cities who are like, students are actually living in BTR. God, I honestly did not know. And it's like, well, hang on a minute, you're the one approving all of these products.
Well, yeah.
So that is a major concern from my side of things.
I think that's one of the big discussions at 2 o'clock today. We've got a kind of a cross-sector silos discussion about, and we'll be covering, should these living sectors be siloed when people just want a home to live. It is your favourite topic, and you've been flying the flag for that ever since episode 1. But really, and the labels aren't being dictated to by the residents, and they're probably not really being dictated to by the operators either. It's a lot of it is a planning situation.
And we know time and time again, we do lots of surveys out to the sector, and we're often debating is, we need to ask you what kind of accommodation you're living in, and it's really hard to ask that question because they haven't got a clue what kind of accommodation. They don't know they're living in BTR or PBSA, and I think that's a real issue that we always talk about as well, is that we don't really market our sector to the customer, so they don't really understand what we're doing for them or what we're building for them, and I think that's...
And they don't care about the acronyms. This is the trouble. We just haven't done a good enough job.
House.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's been very amenity-led.
Yeah.
And I think the whole sector is probably guilty of that. And why not? When you've got amazing amenities, that's what you want to push. But actually, for a lot of tenants, they want safety, security, longevity, security of tenure, well managed. And they're the less sexy things, but they are the most important things. Everybody wants a safe, secure home. That's their need.
And I think that panel discussion on residential silos, I think, is going to be really interesting, and lots of new ideas across Europe coming across on that. So I think I'm looking forward to that session, which I think is today at 2 p.m. So do come back for that.
Now, on the subject of sexy things, single-family housing, I think this is...
We also haven't talked about co-living, though, which I do need to talk about.
True. And I think the thing with co-living is that it's almost... working out what that identity of co-living is.
Exactly, yeah.
Is it a subset of BTR? Is it something in its own right? Is it, studio-led, rented living?
No.
I think this is the thing that, it was actually Harris Associates that we saw put out a poll. What do you think we should call co-living? I think that's a real challenge. Again, it cuts back to that identity crisis. But I know we've got Jamal from Art Co-Living, who is coming onto one of our panels shortly. And ask the expert session. And I think it's really interesting to get their take on it. We've all seen some of those properties. We've seen a lot of the other co-living properties as well. That definitely has its place in the market. But again, without student, does that really work? Is that viable, or is it more, let's focus on that placemaking and just, it doesn't matter who you are, we are just a homogenous shared living sector, and co-living is carving out its own niche within that. I don't know what you think.
Well, I just think co-living, I think we've got to think about the movement of people through houses as their life progresses, and they go from needing to being a student where I always see student a bit as a halfway house. It's my first chance to be independent, but I've got a support network around me.
A bit of pastoral care as well. Yeah,
and it's all there. So then I'm going to go into the world of work, and I'm going to go and live, and I can't afford to rent. Well, only the fortunate few are going to be able to afford to rent a place by themselves. So they're going to have to go into shared housing. And that's great if you're moving to a city and you know that you've got a group of friends that you can already go and live with. But like me, I didn't have that. I moved to London. I had to move into shared house with people I didn't really know. And that, to me, is what co-living can offer, is that it's kind of a bit of that actually I don't need to go into, a random place and just find random people. Actually, I can go into a co-living community and I know they're all people in the same place. And that's why I don't think it's studios. And that's one of my frustrations about co-living in the UK, is that we are on this trajectory of just building studios. And I know I've said it before, and that just reminds me of kind of like a 90s bedsit. And I'm not saying co-living is like bedsits at all, but it's a similar kind of layout, and that's kind of... But
when that happens, I think that's where the community element has to be so strong.
Exactly.
And there are some amazing operators that are really, really doing that. It doesn't work if you're just living isolated in a studio flat. But people have to want it as well, the residents. We've all worked in operations, and it's really hard to get residents to do stuff, and getting them to want to be part of a community is hard. You have to find that like-mindedness, that shared values, and that takes a lot of thought and curation. It shouldn't be random.
Yeah, I agree. And so it's co-living service-led BTR, but BTR would take umbrage with that because they focus very much on the services, etc. And again, we come back to this slight identity crises that we have within the sector. But moving on to single-family housing, it is the darling at the moment of institutions.
I was going to say, you introduced it as like sexy. So what makes single-family housing sexy to you, Dan?
Definitely not the people that work in it, knowing them as I do. But no, I think when you look at the capital that's being deployed at the moment, the stat that is quite staggering is that 2%, if you cover single-family housing within BTR, the stat, 2% of BTR investment in 2020 was single-family housing. In 2025, it's 59%. Like, that is pretty staggering. So, ultimately that does show that it's pretty sexy in terms of what the investors are looking for. And it really is the darling. There was just over 3 billion invested last year, big institutional capital ploughing into that pretty hard. We're seeing it on a daily basis, which is, I think it's great. But, yes, there are a few headlines, especially in The Guardian, that are saying, look, we're selling all our houses off to the highest bidder, and we're going to be entrenched within institutional capital for renting. Is that such a bad thing? Is this going to organise and professionalise renting? And I think there's an element where that's definitely what we're going to need. But that sort of institutional capital shifting to single-family housing, possibly because they can't get BTR off the ground and you can't get that viability as much. And student looks like it's waning slightly for some. It is really interesting.
Well, I guess there's a COVID impact there as well, in that actually, and an affordability impact. Is actually a lot of people can't actually afford to live in the cities, which is largely where BTR is being built. And single-family housing has the opportunity to build out in the suburbs and more regionally. And like you said, Sarah, single-family housing isn't necessarily for a single family to live in. It is for that house share example can go and live in a single-family housing. And I think that is probably providing a type of housing that people need, that if they can't afford to live in the city, but they can afford to live a little bit out and commute in when they need to 1 or 2 days a week because they don't need to be in the office 5 days a week, that becomes a sensible housing option for them.
I totally agree, and it does allow that autonomous living as well. Like, it's got its challenge operationally, single-family housing, if you're centralising things and trying to professionalise that. But ultimately, I think it's a really viable option for people at various different phases. Like you said, everyone needs a certain type of rental living within different times of their life. And so I think that's where single-family housing is really stealing a march to sort of get in there as a real institutional alternative darling of real estate.
I mean, I grew up in rented living, and we had to move several times because the landlord wanted to sell up. And I remember my mum painting my bedroom purple, which I loved when I was 12, and the landlord didn't like it. And, that was awful. That was my home. And, I think that's what single-family housing brings. It's that security, like what we were saying before, of tenure, and that people can live for the first time, and the renters' rights as well has helped with that they can live long-term renting in something that feels like their home without that risk of it being sold from, underneath them. And I just can't see how increasing the spotlight on renting and having all this investment into rental property can ever be negative. Like we've always said, we're naive if we think that buying can continue to be achievable for so many people. So renting has to take that place, but in a high quality and secure way.
I think, like Sarah, we've always said, is that I don't think the rented living sector does enough to tell people the fact that we're not going to kick you out, we're in it for rental properties. And I think that's something from a marketing standpoint we're still not quite seeing enough of, that actually you've got rental security here because of the way that we're invested in, set up and structured. And we need to tell that story more.
I think we're starting to see more movement there. So you take a look at Brendan Geraghty and the Association for Rental Living, one of our sponsors, and actually they have a networking event at 4 p.m. tonight, so do come along to that. That is also with us too, with Resi Consultancy and Property Marketing Strategist. But there is that more coordinated approach there. We are starting to see a bit more movement. Are we starting to see the government listen to any of that? Absolutely not. That is the biggest frustration. Whether you talk to anyone at UKRE, which is formerly the BPF, RE UK, which is formerly the BPF, British Property Federation, or the ARL, Association for Rental Living, they're just not seeing the traction within government, and that is still one of our big bugbears. So, we're very much hoping
and
that...
that's not going to happen now for another few months again.
I don't even want to think about what's going to happen over the course of the next probably 3 months, realistically, internally with the Labour Party and the government. But do keep your eye out for Andy Burnham. Just tap me on the shoulder if you do see him before I say something that I regret.
But you talk about single-family housing being the sexy sector. I actually think rented later living is the sexy sector.
You love this.
I do. I really, really love it because I think that there's such a need for it. There's so many amazing retirement homes that are going up, but they're for people to buy. And not everyone can afford to buy, and they're also being highly amenitized. They're very, very expensive. There are people in the older generation who either need to rent because they haven't ever been able to get a mortgage, or they want to rent because they don't want a mortgage anymore. They might want flexibility. They might want to do 6 months here, 6 months there.
They might want to give their home to their children.
Yeah. Or rent it out and and move on. There's so many reasons why the older generation should wants to rent, but again, it's a bit of it's a slow burner, because I think people can't really get their heads around why somebody who is in retirement would not want to keep their home to bequest to their the younger generation. And again, are we the older generation living so much longer? Is that a thing anymore, really?
But again, I think this is where labels matters, and I think I've said this several times, is I don't think later living is the right label for it, because I think where it's aiming for is kind of over 55, over 65, and they don't see themselves as later living. They're kind of in the prime of their
they're
life.
My siblings, and they definitely wouldn't.
And I mean, my mum's like 78 this year, maybe 77. And like her, she'd never think about going into later living, and she'd feel that if she did, that she'd be giving up. So I think that, again, I think we really need to think about what we're calling these things and what that means to the customer, because I think that's really important. I think I've said before, like, my mum loves a garden, and lots of these places, they don't really give that opportunity for her to go, and that keeps her young and active. And if you don't have that, then actually you're not going to attract them in. So you've really got to think about these spaces and who's going to use them, and that actually what we want is active, mature people in them, not older, later
Exactly,
people.
but we dance around that a little bit in terms of, is it senior housing, is it later living, is it retirement? Like, what should this look like? I mean, it's almost as if there needs to be a consultancy specialising in property marketing.
But hey, why don't we just make homes for people and let people decide where they want to live?
And that is the homogenous shared living sector.
But there are. I mean, you have later living type people.
Yep.
I'm sure living in co-living and BTR, because it suits their needs.
Yeah,
What would they need that's different in its own kind of sector? I did some work years ago with a retirement living developer, and I asked in the community space where the USB and the plug sockets were so people could work, and they looked at me like I was crazy, because they were like, but I'm like, this is over 55, do you think they're not working? Like, of course they are. They want to work in the communal space and plug their laptops in as they would in BTR or co-living. So I think the because people are living so much longer, 1 in 4 people will be over 65 by 2040. So that later living needs to shift and be something different.
But look at Attenborough. I mean, he turned 100 last week. He's still working. He's still going out doing what he needs to do.
He'll still need his USB sockets.
Probably, yeah.
I would say David Attenborough's possibly an exception to but yeah, it is something we absolutely need to be really mindful of. 50,000 senior housing units are needed annually. So this doesn't feel like it's a viability problem. It feels like it's educating the sector and educating potential residents, and that's the challenge that we've got.
I guess just lifting the lid a little bit on kind of how we've organised this summit, we have really struggled to get representatives from the rented later living space to be on any panels because there just aren't enough of them. So hopefully if we were to do this again in a year's time, which we hope we will, we would see that change.
And it might not be called later living.
Yeah.
So on with the show. Now the last thing we really want to talk about is effectively that discussion around AI versus, that's the next real focus. So we will be making sure that we are covering everything across leasing, operations, maintenance, marketing, resident communications. Everybody wants to talk about AI, but it's not just the usual suspects talking about it. And I class myself as a usual suspect. I make that joke before you jump in there, Dini. But ultimately, I think understanding real estate first and foremost is key, because we come to these events, we see the same prop tech PMS people talking on stage because they paid a fortune to sponsor, and what we wanted to do was open that up effectively to say, right, how do we take this end to end? And so the panel session that we'll be covering at 3 o'clock today.
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock today. I should really know that given that I'm moderating it. At 3 o'clock
Please
today.
be there.
I can't promise, but we'll be covering that end-to-end cycle. It's not just operations, it's not a demo of VerbaFlow or anything along those lines, but it is ultimately saying, right, from development, acquisition, investment, design, planning, right the way through to operations, asset management, all of that good stuff. What is out there, what looks good, and how are people using it? But most importantly, what's it going to look like in 2 years, in 5 years' time? Because I think that's absolutely key. And anyone, treating AI as infrastructure rather than a sort of bolt-on service, I think they're going to be the winners. And again, you can take that with a pinch of salt, because of course I'm co-founder of VerbaFlow. I am trying to push that, of course, but I can't do that credibly without it being something that solves a problem, and that is what everybody needs to think about. AI, however you put it in, has to solve a problem. Can't just bolt it on, can't just be, this is a nice to have. It actually has to work and do a job that maybe not right now that it's fulfilling everything that you would hope, but that in 2 years' time, this is what it's going to look like. And I don't think there are enough people within the sector that are really championing that and really understand it.
I think it's that new shiny thing, isn't it? A bit like sustainability was. It's like, I need to do it, but actually not really fully understanding how to do it.
But also I think there's some hesitancy because it's changing so much. People are scared to invest too much time, too much money, too much effort in case it changes
Yeah.
But it's changing in terms of every area. So, leasing ops, maintenance, resident communications, investment development, like we've covered, but also in terms of marketing. So I know that on Thursday at 11 a.m, that marketing session is going to cover AI. That's going to be really important because the algorithms are shifting. We know that people are changing the way that they search. It's not just going to be ChatGPT, find me the best student housing in Bournemouth or whatever it might be. It's going to be, let me tell my AI agent to go and find me the best student housing in Bournemouth, at which point the website goes further down the funnel. What happens to the booking journey? Is it just about social proof? What AI agents are using, specific marketplaces or university, where are they getting their sources from? Like, all of this stuff really matters, and I think covering that's going to be really important on that session. Oh, right. I think that's covered a lot of it. But yeah, what are you most looking forward to, Sarah?
Oh gosh. I think the sessions that bring together the representatives from the different sectors is what I'm most looking forward to, because we don't often see that. And that's part of the reason why we created this housed summit, is because there's always lots of sessions, but they're very, very siloed. And we thought it's about time that we shine a light on all of those sectors. So I'm really looking forward to everybody having their say, but also potentially seeing some sparks of brilliance about how all these sectors can actually work together.
And Dini?
I think I'm just looking forward to actually having a space where the shared living sector can come together at UKREiiF. I think that's really important. And I think I'm looking forward to all the panels, really. I'm looking forward to moderating the resident one. I'm looking forward to the silos one, because that's my passion, is that I don't think we should have silos. But also, just in true house style, is kind of getting some debate going and actually thinking about, well, how can we do things differently? We've got lots of challenges, but instead of just saying, oh, it's a bit tough, let's kind of work through those challenges and see what we can come out the other side to disperse those challenges.
I think that's one of the key things. Like, we don't have all the answers. You know, us as podcast hosts or consultants, like, we have to work with each of our clients. And I think that's absolutely key. And we want to make sure we understand what those challenges are. You know, is it how do we implement AI? Is it how do we build BTR? How do we make student viable? What's happening within the HMO market, student HMO market, etc.? How do we ensure that later living is a concept that really takes off? Is co-living BTR? Like, all of these things, we don't have the answers. We just want to be able to have that open and transparent conversation there. So
the one answer we do have, though, is I really think that rented living sector has a role to play in the housing crisis.
Yeah.
And this is the crisis we're in, so that's why I think all these conversations are super important.
I completely agree. So the sectors all have different labels. Some of those are the wrong labels at the moment, and that needs a bit of work for sure. But increasingly, they are solving the same problem within the shared living sector. And with that, that is a wrap. Thank you very much to all of our sponsors of the summit. And we do hope you'll all stick around. But we'd like to thank Collegiate UK, our platinum partners, our gold partners, Aboda Student Living and Utopia, our silver partners, Howard Kennedy, the eWord, Evolution Sustainability Group and Alasco, bronze partners, TLJ Access Control and Verbaflow, strategic partners, the ARL, the Association for Rental Living, so do stick around for their networking a bit later on at 4, and our networking. And then our value partners, Fresh, so this is Fresh, Fresh Student Living, Payer, Housing Hand, Scape, Miru Visuals, Zenith Signs, Jake Jennings for design, and Loft UK. Thanks very much for all the furniture. And thank you so much for listening. This is the first of our UKREiiF specials this week, so do like and subscribe on all your podcast channels to be the first to access all those episodes as soon as they land. After UKREiiF, we will be back in June for more housed shared living podcasts. Thanks very much for listening. And to you guys, thank you very much to our live studio audience. Please do stick around for our next session. That is at 12:15. Go and grab a coffee or whatever you need and head back here. That'll be question time with the sector experts. And so, you know, we know that they'll all have a hell of a lot to say on those topics that we love. So do please come prepared with some questions. Thanks very much for listening.